Personal notice. Danger's my stock and trade. If the job's too tough for you to handle, you got a job for me, George Valentine.
In my book, Shake Some Action 2.0, I ranked the album out of 200.
The amount of restraint I'm holding back to ask what number one was.
The top 5, at least.
Hey, trolling.
Welcome to Abandoned Albums, the documentary podcast where we take a look at some albums that may have been forgotten about over time, and even some albums you just may never have heard of. I'm your host, Keith R. Higgins. Now, I love music, not because I'm a musician, but because I'm a fan.
Can a watch survive the Niagara Falls test? Attached to this heavily weighted ball, can this watch take the full impact of the rocks and rapids?
On this episode of Abandoned Albums, we'll be taking a look at the Shivvers, a power pop group from Wisconsin that had achieved popularity in the late 70s through early 80s throughout the Midwest. Over the years, their popularity and influence has only increased, and it's expanded beyond the Midwest. Although they only released one single during their time together, a series of compilations have been released over the years, culminating in the definitive album released in 2020. We'll be talking about that album today. The Shivvers were Jill Kossoris, Breck Burns, Jim Iannelli, Jim Richardson, Mike Pyle, and Scott Kruger.
I'm Lyle Van. I'm a newscaster. This is The Watch. Handsome, rugged, in the charm and color of natural gold.
My co-pilot today is Stan Clark, writer and editor of If Ever You're Listening, digital magazine on Medium. And we're also joined by John M. Borak, contributing editor of Goldmine magazine, writer, and the author of 4 books: Shake Some Action, The Ultimate Power Pop Guide; John Lennon, Life is What Happens; Shake Some Action 2, A Guide to the Greatest Power Pop Albums from 1970 to 2017; and The Beatles, 100 Pivotal Moments That Shaped a Band and Its Music. Thanks, guys, for joining.
Thanks for having me, Keith. Appreciate it.
John, can you tell us a little bit about the Shivvers so we can give everyone a background?
Yeah, the Shivvers were formed in the late 70s in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. You know, there was a really cool vibe going on with this band. They were sort of a sort of had a 60s pop sensibility and a new wave sort of urgency, kind of if Blondie was more power pop. There were elements of garage rock, girl group, Mercy beat sounds. They shared stages with bands like the Romantics and Shoes, both sort of power pop icons anyway. Yeah, just a very, very cool live act from what I had heard. A lot of power, a lot of passion. They did a lot of really cool covers and released only one single. And the classic song is called Teen Line. That was the A side of the single. The single is very rare, actually. If you can find it now, it goes for about $500. It was just on a small label in the Wisconsin area. And, they lasted till around 1982. They never did get that big record deal. They had sent demos to Elektra Records, a couple of other major labels, but, just never got that elusive record deal. And then they broke up around 1982. And then around 20 years later, their music started being, reissued and issued. The first single and then a lot of tracks they had recorded at that time, late 70s, early 80s, that never came out, finally came out mid-2000s, up all the way through 2020.
You know what's interesting about the song Teen Line? I don't even remember party lines being a thing in the late 70s.
That song was written from personal experience because Jill mentioned to me when I interviewed her for my piece in the Go Further book, she mentioned that song was written about a romance she had with a guy named Scott Kruger, who later became one of the band members of the Shivvers. It was sort of a long-distance relationship. They were burning up the phone lines, and that's how Teen Line came to be written.
Last night I got a call on the telephone. As long as it can ring, I'm not alone. And the night don't see so far away. It'll be alright someday. And the sun don't have to shine because my heart's
John, how did you get turned on to them?
Well, I've been a power pop fan and writer and collector since probably the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. And back in the 90s, there were all kinds of magazines that covered the genre, like Yellow Pills, Oddities, Pop Sided, Amplifier magazine. And I probably read about the Shivers in one of those magazines. I'm guessing it was Yellow Pills,
Mm-hmm.
or it might have just been me doing some research after, finding out that I wanted to, I was sort of on this quest to find every obscure power pop album that I had heard good things about. And I had heard about the Shivers somewhere, and that's how I found out about them.
See these two portable radios? Well, watch this. Let her go, Betsy. Sorry, friend. You old-style portables have to go.
It seems like ground zero for the modern power pop movement is that Beatles appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show. What was it about that appearance that makes it such a watershed moment?
Well, it was also new. The Beatles were fresh. They had just arrived in America, and there was this frenzy that had been whipped up about them coming here. And I think part of it was that the country may have been looking for something to latch onto because John F. Kennedy had just been assassinated a few months prior to the Beatles coming here. And so the country was still kind of grieving. And then, this new explosion just sort of happened, and it took maybe it took the country's mind off all of the horrible things that had happened in Dallas a few months before. But, I think that the fact that the band was new, the sound was new, everything was all so different. There was never anything like this before. The Beatles didn't sound like anything that had come before them. They, took aspects of country and rock and blues and soul, but they kind of cooked up this completely different sound. And this was the first time a lot of Americans had the chance to hear it and see it. And back then, I think the visual aspect of the Beatles for a lot of people was almost as important as the musical aspect, because they didn't look like the typical rock and rollers. They didn't have the slicked back hair of Elvis Presley or Fabian or any of the teen idols that had come before them. It was all new. It was all different. And I think that's what made the Ed Sullivan Show such a watershed moment, as you mentioned, was that people were able to experience this in their living rooms for the first time in the United States.
Did you see them on the Ed Sullivan Show?
Not unless my mom was feeding me a bottle at that time, because I would have been 2 years old. So.
And the prices are low.
No.
That's why at Robert Hall you save on family clothes.
So, John, you're the power pop guru among the three of us. If we consider the Beatles to be ground zero for power pop, that would mean the first wave of power pop bands would include the Rapsberries, Badfinger, and who am I forgetting?
Big Star.
Right.
I consider the Beatles one of the forefathers of power pop. The Who is really where the term came from, because in 1966, Pete Townsend, that famous quote, "Power pop is what we play," and he likened it to the earlier Beach Boys singles. So a lot of people consider, of course, the early Who singles power pop. So Sad About Us, I Can't Explain, all those great songs. But a lot of people also talk about the three Bs, the Beatles, Beach Boys, and Byrds. And all of those bands have elements of what came to be considered power pop. The Beach Boys had the harmonies, the Byrds had the jangly guitars, the Beatles, of course, had the entire package. So that was the first wave, or the forerunners of power pop. And then the first wave in the early 70s, like you mentioned, Rapsberries, Badfinger, and then adding Big Star to that list. And a lot of people consider Emmett Rhodes power pop as well. Very talented Paul McCartney-like artist from Southern California. And then the second wave, the Knack, 2020, those sorts of bands.
I'm relatively new to the power pop genre. I mean, I grew up in Ohio, so my reference point is just the Knack, Hard Stop. One thing I've noticed, and I don't know how to word this any other way, but there seems to be like a sonic similarity among the bands in the way they're recorded. The sound sounds similar, Am I imagining that, or is there a deliberate sound that power pop is going for?
I don't think there was really a deliberate sound. Back when power pop kind of hit that second wave, right around when the Knack came out, around 78, 79, it was basically two guitars, bass, and drums, just like the Beatles. But I think a lot of bands, may have tried to sound similar to the Knack after the first album came out, Get the Knack, because they were super successful. So people wanted to sort of get in on that punchy, upbeat, two guitar, bass, and drum sound. And, major labels kind of went on a feeding frenzy and started signing every power pop act they could find, hoping they would mirror the success of the Knack. That's how 2020 got signed to Portrait Records. That's how The Beat, Paul Collins' Beat, got signed to Columbia Records. The Plimsolls to Planet Records, numerous others. So I don't think it was a deliberate sort of sound. I think they were just playing the music they wanted to play. And sometimes the producer helped shape the sound.
Speaking of producers, did they have one producer for all these tracks, or did they have various producers? It's sort of a compilation of singles. I'm just sort of curious how the producer thing was working for them.
Yeah, I'm looking at the credits to the record right now, and it says all songs produced by the Shivvers, except one that's co-produced by Jill Kossoris, lead singer, songwriter, keyboard player, and a gentleman named Mike Hoffman. Pretty much this whole thing was self-produced.
John, you end your essay, No Substitute, the story of the Shivvers, which is in the book Go Further. You quote Jill, quote, "If people are responding to the Shivvers, it could be because it's rare to hear a band that hasn't been reshaped by a record label executive, manager, agent, or producer. We never sold out. We ran purely on instinct, inspiration, and the love of rock and roll. And I think you can hear that," unquote. Absolutely. 100%.
Yeah, totally 100% correct. And it's funny because this all ties in. You had mentioned Ohio earlier. One of the classic power pop bands from the early 70s, when the genre was first called power pop, was Raspberries. Raspberries, of course, came from Ohio. Their leader and main songwriter was Eric Carmen, and there's actually a connection between Eric Carmen and the Shivvers. Jill Kossoris was a big Raspberries fan. She loved them when she first heard Go All the Way on the radio. She fell in love. She talks about this in my chapter in Go Further, but she won a contest. The band came to perform at her high school. And then, she ended up contacting Eric Carmen years later after the Shivvers formed, sent him some demos, and he wrote back to her. And he was interested in possibly managing them. He was going to help them find a record deal. And they actually covered some of his songs in concert. They covered a few Raspberry songs and a really cool Eric Carmen solo track called It Hurts Too Much. So there's sort of that connection there.
You may go now, Higgins.
Yes, ma'am. Oh, what's the matter, Mrs. Ballin?
This letter.
Yes?
It's a ransom note.
Ransom?
They want $75,000.
Stan, what was your reaction hearing it for the first time?
So I was really drawn into kind of the melody, the songwriting, her voice, the tone of her voice really stood out to me. I really enjoyed songs like Teen Line, No Substitute, and I drew some connections with the Beach Boys, kind of like those whimsical melodies. It's kind of fun. I even heard a little bit of maybe surf rock in there. And it didn't sound 40 years old for some reason. It felt light. It felt almost too fresh and new to be that old.
And I think that's true with a lot of the power pop, power pop that I've been exposed to recently.
Well, the songs are sort of timeless on the Shivers record, and the sound is not dated. And Stanley, as you said, it doesn't sound like a 40-year-old record. It sounds like it could have been recorded a couple months ago. There wasn't any huge production trickery going on here. They weren't in a huge studio. They weren't going to sound like Phil Collins records from the 80s. I think it helps keep everything fresh. The melodies always at the forefront of all these songs, and Jill's vocals are just so powerful. She comes across as sort of whimsical and light, but there's also a little bit of grit to her voice as well. It doesn't really sound exactly like anything else. I can't think of any other power pop band where I can say, oh yeah, the Shivers sound like them, or they sound like the Shivers. It's a pretty cool original sort of sound. Jill's vocals, she was influenced by a lot of different artists.
Who were Jill's influences?
She loved the Beatles. She tells me a story about her family watching the Beatles on Ed Sullivan. She was 4 years old, and she knew something was going on, and they told her to go to bed because it was past her bedtime. But she snuck down the hall and was watching the Beatles on Ed Sullivan out of the corner of her eye in her parents' living room. And she knew the next day that's what she wanted to do. And she thought, why is nobody else doing this? And why are there no girls in the Beatles? So that's what made her want to start playing music. So it all goes back to them. And her influences included the early Who singles mentioned earlier, ABBA, Motown, girl groups, and even punk rock like the Stooges. Big fan of Iggy Pop. So maybe that's where some of the guitar edge comes from in these songs, is from her love of punk music. So, she takes, like any good musical act, it's sort of an amalgamation of all of their influences. But when you look at the influences that Jill and the rest of the Shivers had, they're all great influences. So how can you not come up with something good, especially when you have really great songs?
When I listen to the Shivers, I hear Chrissie Hynde in the vocals. Her voice is just, they're not identical. It's reminiscent of Chrissie Hynde. The Pretenders never seemed to get labeled as power pop, and they've always been put into that punk rock and roll. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I think the music was a lot different. The Pretenders' music was a little less 60s influenced, maybe a little more angular, and the songs were a little more forceful. But it's a fine line between what is power pop and what isn't power pop. The best definition of power pop I've ever read was by my friend Jordan Oakes, who was the founder and editor of Yellow Pills magazine. He said, well, you asked me to define power pop. I know it when I hear it, and then when I hear it, I want to hear it again.
I'll buy into that.
By and large, power pop is a song-based medium. You can say Rapsberries are a power pop band, which of course most people do, but then you look at the songs that Eric Harmon didn't write for Rapsberries. You look at Dave Smalley's songs, and those are country rock songs, very Eagles sounding. You look at Wally Bryson's songs that he wrote, very guitar heavy, sounded a lot like the band Free. So it's more of a song-based medium. So the Pretenders may have had a few songs that sounded power pop, but by and large, they were sort of lumped into that really hazy genre known as new wave. Now, whatever new wave is, I think basically the way I describe new wave is anything in 1979 that wasn't Fleetwood Mac, Journey, Boston, Styx, Foreigner, or Kansas, that was probably new wave, because it was new, new music. It wasn't the same old acts that had been around for the last 5 or 6 years. It was just something different, fresh, exciting sound. But yeah, I think the Pretenders may be a little more rock, although they did certainly have some songs which kind of, could be maybe considered power pop. Talk of the Town is a very sort of jangly, poppy sort of tune. But then, you listen to their second album, there's a song on there called Bad Boys Get Spanked. And it's really driving and really powerful. And it's like, Yeah, that's something else entirely. So
Yeah, I agreed.
it's just a little bit different.
I was reading an interview with Jill somewhere online, and she said that Tom Petty got lumped into that new wave category with his first album, and she's like, he was more power pop than he was new wave.
Yeah, if you were different, if you weren't part of the musical status quo back then, you were lumped into being power pop or new wave. I mean, a lot of these acts drew their inspiration from the 60s or even the 50s, like Tom Petty. Maybe they presented it in a little bit of a different way, or their look was a little bit different. Tom Petty and his band, they were just good old boys who went out and played the rock and roll. They didn't have all the flash and all of the theatrics that, say, Styx might have had at that point in their career.
Isn't the chicken lucky that eggs are the shape they are? Not square, not rectangular, but perfectly egg-shaped.
What I hear in the Shivers and really power pop as a whole is a certain amount of positivity, like optimism. You just don't hear a lot of anger in these songs.
Yeah, a lot of optimism, a lot of sweetness, without being sappy, and that's a fine line to walk. It's tough to be sweet without being sappy, especially musically. But a lot of these songs, "Please Stand By," for example, very edgy musically, but the lyrics, "Please stand by for love," very very sort of upbeat and a happier sort of lyric.
What were you thinking of? Think you could run? There's no reason now to jump the gun. Oh, please stand by for love. What you're missing now is really tough. It should be easy now. So don't give up. Oh, please stand by for love, for love. Oh, please stand by for love. I got to.
This music is music that makes you feel good. Every time I listen to this Shivers record, I'm amazed how consistent it is from top to bottom, and how the songs all sort of have that joyous feeling to them. You can't really be depressed when you're listening to this record. It's a fun record, for lack of a better term. It's fun to listen to, and the songs all hold up 40 years later.
Oh, look at all that sand and that towel.
That is not attractive, is it?
I should say not.
And there's still sand in that, too.
Look
And
at,
how about the...
look at that.
I know there's a lot of discussion around Spotify, its royalty payouts, and I know in particular now with the podcasting incident, but I think one of the benefits of Spotify is that it's opened up this whole world of new artists to other generations. My source when I was growing up was pretty much Rolling Stone and the records that I listened to. Because if you look at the thank you and the liner notes, you could always be like, oh, well, who's that? Who's that? Who's that? And then that would be my path. But now I have mixed feelings. How do you guys each feel about it? There is an issue with the royalty payments. I think that's a little bit problematic.
The way I use it personally, and this is as a journalist and as a fan, if I read about something online or in a magazine and I want to check it out, I go to Spotify or one of those similar services first and listen to determine whether I want to buy it or not. So it's sort of, I get a little bit of a sampler, and then I'll go and buy it, which is, hopefully the ideal scenario. You go there, you get a little taste of it, and then if you love it enough, you want to support the artist and have the physical product for your collection. Just having that physical media in your hand, something tangible, there's nothing like it for me and for a lot of other folks. But, so I guess to sum it up, I see both sides It can be a valuable tool if used correctly.
Sure.
Back in the day, like you said, Keith, I had to read things in a magazine. I remember I used to read Cream magazine all the time.
Now, Stan, you are of the generation that would probably use Spotify. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I remember Spotify really started to become a thing when I started high school. And so I have a memory of life before Spotify, which I'm thankful for because a lot of people a couple years younger than me don't have that memory. Spotify is the only way they've really discovered music. I'm starting to use it the way John actually has described it. I'm starting to use it as a sampler, and now I'm starting to buy physicals as of 2021, only because I started realizing the royalty thing, the inequality in the royalty payments, but also because I'm noticing, especially without concerts, how much artists are really suffering in the past 2 years. And so coming up with the way that I could support it, especially because I write about it so much. And so I'm constantly ordering CDs. But that's kind of how I'm using Spotify. But the hope is really in the future for the industry to kind of support artists that way. Because a lot of artists don't release their albums physically first. They release it on streaming first, then they'll wait 6 months, and then they'll give you the CD and the vinyl. But by that time, the fan doesn't want to buy the CD because they already heard it for 6 months. And now they're on to a new artist or a new CD because the attention span shrunk so much. So it's kind of a frustrating place. As a fan who appreciates physicals, I think my favorite album that came out last year, this Black Coffee album, he's like this South African house artist, and he still didn't release a CD or a physical or vinyl. And I'm just thinking to myself, that your moment's passed, dude. I mean, I'll buy it when it comes out, but not a lot of people are going to care that much, and that only hurts you. I assume he only really cares about touring and getting money off of live shows and things of that nature. Those are kind of how I sit with streaming in general and Spotify.
That's where a lot of the money comes from now, is not from selling the music, but if you're touring, from merchandise. Another problem we're finding now with the pandemic is that the lead time to release vinyl is almost a year in some cases. It just takes so long to get it manufactured. It seemed like more people are buying vinyl now than CDs, but then I've been reading articles lately saying CDs are making a comeback. Who knows? For me, it's just good to have that physical media out there. For example, with this Shivvers record, it came with a poster, it came with a sticker, it came with some liner notes, printed with an insert, all this cool stuff that you don't get if you're just listening to it, on Spotify or any streaming service.
I want to go back to the musicianship of power pop bands and bands like the Shivvers. Sometimes I think there's a tendency to discount or even marginalize the musicianship of these bands. I'm thinking specifically of the Ramones. I think I was reading in Johnny Ramone's autobiography about just how diligent the band was in learning the songs that came before them so they could then filter it down to what they created. I feel like the same is true with many of these power pop bands. I think the best way to do something unique or original or even good is to have a thorough understanding of what preceded you. I'm curious if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, oh yeah. I mean, there's something to be said about, studying at the feet of the masters, as it were. I can't think of any power pop band who has ever said we hate the Beatles, or any person but especially bands. If you're a power pop band, it pretty much has to all stem from there, at least somewhat. And, speaking of the Ramones, you mentioned, and they're my second favorite band ever, by the way, after the Beatles.
Wow.
Saw them in concert, I think, 5 or 6 times, met them once. But I think Dee Dee Ramone mentioned at one point when he was being interviewed, we wanted to be the Bay City Rollers, but we just couldn't play good enough.
Wow.
So they drew their inspiration from a lot of those bubblegum acts. Everything comes from something else. There's always an influence there. Some power pop bands have more of a prog influence. Some have more of a punk influence. Some might have a little bit of a country influence or a bluesy or soul influence to them. But it's all based off what you listen to, and what you want to pattern yourself after, obviously without sounding exactly like what came before.
When we think of the pantheon of power pop, where do you think the Shivers sit in the pantheon?
Well, I can tell you where I ranked them in my last book, and that's where I think they sit. And I would have to grab my copy here very quickly. The 200 greatest power pop albums of all time, the Shake Some Action book. And again, it's just one person's opinion.
Sure.
I think I ranked them relatively high. Number 49, ahead of groups like the DBs, Todd Rundgren, the Posies. So, I think particularly since these songs haven't been played to death, they're fresh for a lot of people, and they're all so solid. So I think, if you're looking at acts and not albums, certainly one of the top 50 power pop acts ever. I would rank them up there. And the fact that they're fronted by a woman, and not a lot of power pop bands were fronted by women, and don't ask me why that is. Not only fronted by a woman, but somebody who had a wonderful, awesome stage persona, great voice, could write songs and play keyboards. That's they're definitely up there in my book, in the pantheon of power pop, as you say.
For sure. Oh, I had something on the tip of my tongue. Fuck, I hate that. Oh, I know what it was. What happened to the Shivers?
Well, basically, from what Jill told me, they just sort of imploded. I think there were a lot of personality things going on within the band. Again, I think Jill and Scott, at least at some point, were a couple. And, that in bands doesn't always go well. Now, I'm just guessing here. I don't know that for a fact. There's a quote in my article from one of the Shivers named Mike Pyle. He was the guitar player or bass player? He was a rhythm guitar player. And it's funny because we were friends on Facebook before I even realized he was in the Shivers.
Oh, wow.
And, or maybe I knew it and didn't think about it. And then I thought, wow, I'm writing this article. It'd be great to get another person's perspective along with Jill's. So Mike is quoted in the article as well. He said, one of the things he said, and I'm quoting, "We're talking about 5 people doing this one thing together, but each having a very different experience, especially the last 6 months or so. Bands get complicated."
Mm-hmm.
So, that it's what happens to a lot of bands, especially if you're together for a little while. Personalities, one person wants something, another band member might want something else. There's conflicts, and they were getting frustrated. Frustrated about not being signed, frustrated about not getting to that next level. And that's why they disbanded in 1982, which again is too bad. But boy, certainly lucky to have this music now being released for everyone to enjoy.
Absolutely. And then what happened to the band after they broke up?
Well, they all continued in music.
Mm-hmm.
Jill released some solo records, which I have that are really, really cool. They're all still writing or performing. Mike Pyle, who I mentioned, he moved to Boston. He was in a band called Hummingbird Syndicate. They released a couple of records. So they've been, Jill says they're all lifers.
Yeah.
They're still doing this. It wasn't a side thing for them. or as Jill says, this was not a hobby or a fad. You know, Jill still writes with Scott Kruger to this day, but they're all still out there, you know, in one way or another doing music, which is good.
That's awesome. Her solo work, would you label that as power pop, or did she go in a different direction?
I think, for lack of a better term, it's maybe a little more, well, if I say sophisticated, it makes it sound like the Shivvers thing is unsophisticated, which it's certainly not, but a little more adult oriented. And of course that stands to reason because, you know, it's years later. A little more keyboard based mainly because Jill's a keyboard player. But again, just great melodies, her beautiful voice, and you know, anything she does is certainly worth listening to. Very, very talented artist.
Well, I'm going to wrap it up. I want to thank you, John, for your time, your insight. I appreciate it. It's been great. I think it was a great discussion. I learned a lot. Stan, thank you for your time. Any final thoughts?
Oh, just wanted to thank you both for having me, Keith and Stanley. It's been a pleasure to speak with you. If anyone wants to see what I'm doing in terms of my journalistic endeavors, you can follow me on Facebook. I have a page, John Borak Author. I also have a personal page, so feel free to follow me there. If you're interested in any of my books, you can hit me up there, or you can visit Amazon or the Rare Bird website for the latest Beatles book. But no, it's been a pleasure talking music with both of you guys. Really enjoyed it.
So much knowledge. I was writing ferociously all the bands because I only heard of like half of them, if that. So I have homework to do.
Yeah, you're half up on me. All right, guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Take care. Have a great weekend, guys.
All right.
Same to you guys.
All right. Bye.
Hi, this is Ira Elliott from Not a Surf.
This is Laura Bethita Neptuna from the Neptunas.
This is Sherry Page from Thick.
This is John Worster from Superchunk, the Mountain Goats, and the Bob Mold Band. You can check out my list of 5 punk songs that will make you a better drummer in the new book, Forbidden Beat, Perspectives on Punk Drumming, from Rare Bird Books. Buy it if you consider yourself my friend. That was too harsh, wasn't it?
Forbidden Beat, Perspectives on Punk Drumming.
Thanks for listening.
Abandoned Albums was recorded at Sage Sound Studios in Shelton, Connecticut. Produced and written by Keith R. Higgins. Engineered and mixed by Nathan Sage. Original music by Mike Pellegrino.
The songs you heard during this podcast were Teen Line, When I Was Younger, Please Stand By for Love, and My Association. All of these songs can be found on the Shivvers' self-titled debut album. Be sure to check out John's books wherever good books are sold, and Stan's digital magazine if ever you're listening on the writing platform Medium. Many thanks to John M. Borak, Stanley Clark, S.W. Loudon, Rob Janicki, Nathan Sage, Mike Pellegrino, Tharina Bella, and executive producer Rufus Thunderlove.
If you like what you've heard, be sure to subscribe and follow us on social media. At Twitter, we are at Abandoned Albums, and on Instagram, we are at Abandoned_albums.
I forget if this was George or John who had said it, that once Ringo got on the beat, you couldn't drag him off of that with a crane. He was just rock solid. He didn't need, he was the Click. He was just perfect for that band, and amazingly creative, and doesn't get nearly the credit he deserves.
And now, until we meet again next time, I remain as always obediently yours.